The third topic that I want to talk about today is probably the hardest of all, and that is, does terrorism work? Does it succeed? Is this why people use it? So in recent years, as in my other questions that I've tried to address, we've had a lot of vigorous debates over whether or not terrorism works for those who use it. Does it actually accomplish their goals? Do groups use terrorism because they expect it to work? Is it really as simple as that? The first problem to recognize here is that it's extremely difficult to measure the effectiveness of terrorism. Those who are challenging the status quo will almost never just use terrorism. They almost always, not exclusively, but almost always use other methods as well. So how can we say what terrorism did for them as opposed to their other activities or blunders on the part of the government or circumstances beyond anybody's control? Consider, as an example, the terrorism used by the FLN, the National Liberation Front, during the Algerian War from 1954 to 1962. Certainly, the result of the war was the withdrawal of the French and Algerian independence, and the case is often cited as an example of the success of terrorism. But did terrorism really contribute very much to the outcome? Was it productive or was it counterproductive? We might think, by the way, of random attacks on civilians as an Al-Qaeda hallmark, but the FLN really launched the era of urban terrorism during the famous Battle of Algiers in 1956 and 1957. I imagine some of you watching this have seen the film, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it. I will also remind you that the actor who's playing the chief terrorist, the leader of the organization in Algiers, is actually the terrorist himself. He played himself in the movie, and the movie was his idea. So, getting back to the subject of what did all of this do for the FLN, even people who were very sympathetic to the FLN, indeed Algerians themselves, some of these people felt that terrorism was actually counterproductive. And one reason was that it provoked such a harsh repression from the French that the cause of independence was set back for years. We can't know that, it's a counterfactual, but quite possibly terrorism had more harmful than beneficial effects. Look at another case that's quite timely now, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, the predecessor of ISIS. The brutal tactics of Zarqawi, who was the then leader of AQI, and he was later killed in an American bombing raid, his tactics were so extraordinarily brutal that Zawahiri, who was then the number 2 of Al-Qaeda and is now the number 1 of Al-Qaeda, criticized him directly in a letter that was widely circulated, including by the U.S. government for obvious reasons because it was so critical of Zarqawi. The methods that AQI used alienated potential supporters among the Sunni population of Iraq, and they contributed to the emergence of what we call the Arab Awakening, which was a rebellion of tribal elements in Iraq who turned against AQI and began to assist coalition forces. If this hadn't happened, we don't really know whether or not the surge in American troops would have worked as well as it did. We also need to introduce the idea of tactical versus strategic success. So terrorism will almost always get a group publicity. It'll put the cause on a national or international agenda. It gets you name recognition. Everybody knows who you are now. It can also be a good revenue producer. We know that kidnappings by jihadist organizations in the Middle East and in North and West Africa have garnered large amounts in ransom in recent years. In fact, newspaper reports tell us it's millions and millions of dollars. Kidnappings have also secured the release of prisoners. Think of the famous case of Israel and Gilad Shalit. They were willing to release hundreds of prisoners to get back one of their own soldiers. But the question is, will these successes go beyond short-term gains? Now, some people are pretty clear about saying yes, and in fact, some people have argued that campaigns of suicide terrorism in particular lead foreign occupying powers that are democratic to withdraw from conflicts where they've intervened. And the reason is supposedly that in a democracy, the public is going to put pressure on the government to withdraw when involvement becomes painful. Now, if terrorism did have this effect, it would really be a pretty significant achievement. But a lot of things about this explanation are not clear at all and not convincing to me. One is, why would suicide terrorism be more effective as a form of coercion than some other form of terrorism? Why would the person being blown up with the bomb have more of an impact on me than simply a bomb? I think I would be much more sensitive to the number of people killed or wounded or the destructive impact of the action rather than whether or not it was suicide. And also, are democracies really susceptible to coercion? There are other scholars who've studied this issue who answer pretty definitively no. So the opposite side of this debate is that terrorism only causes democracies to be more resistant to terrorist demands. From this point of view, terrorism has never produced any fundamental concessions. In fact, the opposite happens. Public attitudes are hardened. And indeed, in the summer of 2014, we can see that the American response to ISIS terrorism and its advance into Iraq is military escalation. There's no indication that we're more inclined to give in. Israel's response to Hamas and to Hezbollah has been quite harsh, despite short-term prisoner releases. In fact, because terrorism provokes such a strong backlash effect, it's very useful for groups that want to be spoilers in peace processes. These are usually small groups who object to compromise, they object to negotiations because they think they're going to be left out, and they try to use terrorism to interrupt it by hardening attitudes on all sides. And I will say that often they are successful at this, but whether they get the end result of what they want is another question. So, in conclusion, the issue of effectiveness is extremely complicated. It's not simply a yes or no answer. Let me explain it this way. Organizations have to survive if they're going to profit from the achievement of their long-term goals. Say they want to establish a particular type of regime. They want to be in control when they establish this regime. They want to be the new government in power. So they want to win the overall struggle. They want to advance their ideological cause, but they also want to come out on top of a power struggle among other groups who want pretty much the same thing. It's almost never the case that there's only one challenger to a government. There are multiple parties who are fighting a government for the same cause. So if a group is going to have any long-term gain, they have to have short-term gain. We call this using terrorism as a form of outbidding in extremism. This means that competition among groups produces an escalation of violence. Each one tries to outbid the other to win an internal power struggle. So they want the long-term goal, certainly. They also want to win out against their friends as much as their enemies. Thus, as a consequence, in Syria, much of ISIS violence is directed against rival Islamist groups, as well as the Assad regime. Thank you.